Hello everybody, my name is Zach with Overrated Gamers, and today we're going to be doing a deck tech on Eldrazi, one of Magic's most iconic villains. This deck has two possible commanders to switch from for it. I either run Child of Alara, which is one of every color for a 6/6 with trample. When it dies, destroy all non-land permanents. This is good if you plan on playing the deck a bit slower, if you want to build up some board presence, if you want to run a few more control type cards in the deck. Or you can run Sliver Queen. She's one of every color, 7/7, pay 2 mana, put a 1/1 Sliver creature token into play. Now, the Sliver Queen is nice if you just want to make a bunch of guys that you can block with. You can sacrifice them to an Evolutionary Leap. We don't run that many creatures, so your odds of getting a decent sized Eldrazi from Evolutionary Leap are pretty high. And there's an Eldrazi that gives colorless creatures +1/+1, and another one that gives them haste. So if you have a bunch of them and you have a bunch of mana, you can give them all haste, because they are colorless. Getting into the Eldrazi, the first one is Forerunner of Slaughter. He's a black and a red for a 3/2. He has an ability called Devoid. Creatures that have Devoid are colorless, even if you pay colorless mana for them. So this card can be killed by things like Slaughter Pact or Doomblade or things that kill quote-unquote non-black creatures. He is colorless. He is not an artifact, he is just a colorless creature. He has pay 1, give a colorless creature haste until end of turn. So we give our big Eldrazi haste, we run the Annihilator ones, just allows for immediate swings with all of them. He comes out pretty early in the game. We have Mana Reshaper. He's 2 and a colorless, so that diamond symbol in a mana cost means that you have to pay a colorless mana, so not one of any mana, but specifically colorless. My 5-color deck does run filter lands, so they are very useful in this deck, and I would highly suggest running them if you build a 5-color Eldrazi deck. When he dies, reveal the top card of your library. You may put it onto the battlefield if it's a permanent with converted mana cost 3 or less, otherwise put it into your hand. So he's a decent blocker to put out early on. A lot of our Eldrazi do cost 10, 11, 12. He can get you land if that's the top card. So your top card's a land, you can put it into play. Obviously you can use Vampiric or Worldly Tutor to get a small card that you want on top of the deck so you can get it into play. You can respond to it with him. Nice versatile card, good to have early on. Our next card is Ruination Guide. It's 2 and a blue. It has Devoid, has an ability called Ingest. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles the top card of his or her library. And other colorless creatures you control get +1/+0. So it's more useful if you're running Sliver Queen, which is the main one that I run when I play this deck. It makes your Eldrazi a little larger. Overall, it's actually not that great, since turning a 10/10 into an 11/10 doesn't really mean much. It's mostly in here just so I have more Eldrazi. At one point, I liked having a certain amount of cards in my tribal decks. I'll probably pull it out at some point, or if Wizards ever prints more Eldrazi and there's one that catches my eye. For now, it's just kind of sitting there. Catacomb Sifter, 1 a black and a green. Devoid. When it enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token onto the battlefield. It has sacrificed this creature, add 1 to your mana pool. So all Eldrazi Scions have that ability, so any other time I mention a Scion, you can sacrifice it for a colorless. Whenever another creature you control dies, scry 1. Scry run is look at the top card of your library. You may put that on the top or bottom of your library. So we do run Sliver Queen once again, usually when I'm playing the deck. Those tokens die, I get a scry 1. It's a nice effect, and I can sacrifice that token later to get an Eldrazi out a turn earlier. Eldrazi Obligator. He is 2 and a red, Devoid. When you cast it, you may pay 1 and a colorless. If you do, gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste until end of turn. and the Obligator is a 3/1, and he does have haste as well. One of the big things about Eldrazi that when Wizards made them, a lot of them have cast effects. So even if they're countered, you still get an effect off of them. Eldrazi Obligator is one of them, and it's nice because you can get it on about turn 5. I would always cast this card with the cast effect. It really does nothing without it. It's just a 3/1 with haste. And even if it's countered, you still gain control of their creature until end of turn. You could swing with it, then you can either sacrifice it to high market, or you can sacrifice it to something like a Sidisi, or to Evolutionary Leap, or, you know, just do a lot of damage to them with it. It's a strong card for the deck. It comes out early, it comes out late, it's good at any point in the game. And it's pretty hard to deal with because they would have to stifle its triggered effect, and Stifle is not run very often, if at all, in Commander. You might run across a Void Slime, but I mean, if that's the ability they choose to Void Slime over one of your larger Eldrazi that exiles 2 permanents, that's fine. After this, we start getting into the higher cost Eldrazi. So we have Oblivion Sower, 6 mana, 5/8. When you cast it, target opponent exiles the top 4 cards of his or her library. Then you may put any number of land cards that player owns from exile onto the battlefield under your control. Now, they do come into play untapped, unless it's something like a shock land. You would still have to pay the 2 life. But you can hit a bunch of their fetch lands. There is a Deathrite Shaman in this deck, so it does just happen to function pretty well with this ability too. I've gotten as many as 20 lands from a player later in the game. We do have Ulamog, who also exiles cards, so you can exile a bunch, later on drop this, get even more lands, and then you're just continually casting Eldrazi from your hand with an absurd amount of large creatures, and just swinging for lots of damage very quickly all of a sudden. Endbringer, 5 and a colorless for 5/5. It untaps during each other player's untap step, and it has 3 abilities. The first one is tap it, deal 1 damage to a creature or player. Pay a colorless and tap it. Target creature can't attack or block this turn. Pay 2 colorless, tap it, draw a card. There is a Seedborn Muse in this deck. We have a lot of filter lands, so they can feed into those abilities. Drawing a card during each other player's turn is pretty solid. You can prevent something large of theirs from attacking. Something like Blightsteel, Molten Steel, their commander. And being colorless, he does get around pretty much every sword. So unless they have boots on it, which is somewhat unlikely if they're trying to put swords on it, you can prevent it from hitting you, and there's nothing they can do about that. And tapping to deal 1 damage to a creature or player. I mean, if you don't really have colored mana, you don't have much else to do, why not ping the other player for 1? You can, hit all their small creatures, stuff like that. It's a nice versatile card in the deck. Usually you're going to be trying to draw cards or preventing a creature from attacking or blocking. Conduit of Ruin, 6 mana, 5/5. Once again, another Eldrazi with cast triggers. When you cast it, you may search your library for a colorless creature with converted mana cost 7 or greater. Reveal it, shuffle your library, put that card on top of it. And the first creature spell you cast each turn costs 2 less. So combine this with Eye of Ugin and your first Eldrazi costs 4 less. So if you have him out and Eye of Ugin out, you can tutor for like a Kozilek. And on your next turn, that Kozilek only costs 7. So you can bring that out on turn 7 by setting it up with the Conduit of Ruin. And, I mean, now it is worth noting that the turn he comes out, his -2 effect doesn't do anything because he is your first creature spell. Sire of Stagnation, or as I like to call him, Consphinx 2.0. He's not better, so I guess he'd be like Consphinx 0.5. I don't know. He's 4, a blue, and a black for 5/7, devoid. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, that player exiles the top 2 cards of his or her library and you draw 2 cards. Now he is 6 mana, so I mean by the time you get him out, your opponents can just decide not to play lands. It's kind of doubtful though, they'll probably try to play lands, or they may skip a few land drops. Worst comes to worst, you slow your opponents down when it comes to playing land, because they don't want to draw you all those extra cards. Best case scenario, they have to play lands, and if they're running fetches, you get 4 cards off of that. This also feeds the Oblivion Sower later on, which is a nice little bonus. They exile cards, it happens to be land, well, the O-Sower gets you more land. O-Sower is not in here because all these cards exile things, it just happens to work nicely with them, and it has a nice effect of its own. But these cards are not based around Oblivion Sower, they just happen to work well. World Breaker, 6 and a green devoid. When it enters the battlefield, exile an artifact, enchantment, or land. It has reach, meaning it can block flyers. Pay 2 and a colorless, sacrifice a land, return it from your graveyard to your hand. So you can actually just start eating 1 land per turn with this card. It'll cost you a land, but you can get some of those back Eternal Witness only really gets them back once. But later in the game, it can be worth it. If you have a lot of land, you just start bringing them out, exile, like the artifact player's lands or something like that. Start exiling artifacts. Usually you just exile something like a Gaia's Cradle, a Mana Crypt, a Soul Ring, things like that. Gilded Lotus is a nice target, swords. So it's a really good removal spell that happens on cast, and it has a nice strong body. And if they counter it, well then you can get it back and do it again. So your opponents are going to think twice before they try to counter this card, and at worst, well, they counter it and then they stifle it, or then you've 2-for-1'd them. Or, once again, if they play something like Void Slime, they really want to protect that artifact. Well, after this, you can then just cast a Krosan Grip and kill it anyway. But yeah, a lot of the Eldrazi have the cast effects. We're not even at the best cast effects yet, but all of them provide a lot of really nice 2-for-1s. Void Winnower, 9 mana, 11/9. Your opponents can't cast spells with even converted mana costs, and your opponents can't block with creatures with even converted mana costs. Now 0 is even. I guess you could say your opponent can't even, haha. Yes, that joke's oversaid. If you actually take a look at the Magic Gatherer page, there's a little thing in the rules with Wizards saying, yes, we get it, you can't even. It's actually kind of funny. I like little stuff like that. But anyway, prevents your opponents from casting anything with even converted mana costs. Basically half the cards in Commander. Prevents things like Rampant Growth, Skyshroud Claim. You can't really think, like Rafika the Many. So, it keeps your opponents from casting a lot of their commanders. Keeps your opponents from casting things... Well, it keeps your opponents from casting some of their Eldrazi if they have their own Kozileks. Just tons of stuff like that. Molten Steel Dragon can't be cast. Can't cast Craterhoof Behemoth. Can't cast Demonic Tutor. Our next card is Artisan of Kozilek. It's a 9 mana 10/9. When you cast it, you can turn a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you can reanimate the new Kozilek, the new Ulamog. The original Ulamog and Kozilek shuffle back into your graveyard when they hit the graveyard. You can also bring back some of your smaller Eldrazi like Sire of Stagnation, or if for some reason you need a blocker, you can bring back the World Breaker. A lot of your Eldrazi have cast triggers, so there's only a few that you actually reanimate with this. He also has an ability called Annihilator 2. This is only on the original Eldrazi from the first Zendikar set. They never reprinted it in the second one. Annihilator 2, whenever this creature attacks, defending player sacrifices 2 permanents. It's the same ability no matter what, it'll just have different numbers. So if it's 4, they'll sack 4 permanents. It does trigger on attack, so they have to sack permanents before they declare blockers. So they can't declare a blocker and choose that as a thing to sacrifice. They have to sacrifice, for this one, 2 permanents on attack, then decide if they're blocking it. And they would have to do this if there's multiple instances of Annihilator happening. They'd have to sacrifice everything they want to sacrifice, and then they would go to declare blockers, decide what they want to block with. Annihilator is a very strong ability, and it decimates your opponent's board presence. This is why Wizards never reprinted it. Alright, now we get into the really big Eldrazi. The first one is Kozilek, the Great Distortion. He's 8 and 2 colorless mana. When you cast it, if you have fewer than 7 cards in your hand, draw cards equal to the difference. So if you have 1, you draw 6. If you do have 7 cards, you're out of luck. But you can discard a card with converted mana cost X, counter target spell with converted mana cost X. So they want to play a Path to Exile, you can discard your own to counter it. You can discard your Kozilek to counter their Kozilek, so on and so forth. You can discard your Demonic Tutor to counter their counterspell if they're trying to counter something in yours. It also has Menace, meaning it can only be blocked by 2 or more creatures. So not only does it control the board pretty well and draw you more cards, it's also hard for your opponents to block. We also have the original Kozilek. He's a 10 mana, 12/12. When you cast it, draw 4 cards. Annihilator 4. And when he's put into a graveyard from anywhere, you shuffle your graveyard into your library. So if they've killed a bunch of your Eldrazi, and then this one gets killed, well, you shuffle them all back in, and you do it all over again. Redrop all of them, cast him. Now, he draws you 4 cards regardless, doesn't matter if your hand size. So you can play the first Kozilek, the second Kozilek that I just showed you, draw up to 7, then drop this one, draw 4 more. We don't really run a Reliquary Tower in this deck. It's not really necessary, but it is still pretty good. Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, 10 mana, 10/10, on cast, exile 2 permanents. When he attacks, the defending player exiles the top 20 cards of their library. About 4 to 5 hits with this and you've milled your opponent out of the game. Even if they are blocking every turn, you can also just play an Oblivion Sower after you've dropped this, get a bunch of lands out from your opponent that you're exiling. It does exile 2 permanents on cast. Very hard card for players to deal with, gets you a lot of card advantage. Oh, it's also indestructible, so the only way to get rid of it is through exile, or if your opponent can make you sacrifice it. Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, this is the first Ulamog, 11 mana, 10/10. When you cast it, you destroy a permanent. So his cast trigger is not as good. He is still indestructible though, and he has Annihilator 4. So he trades off, the new Ulamog trades off Annihilator for exiling cards from your opponent's library. Generally I tend to find Annihilators better, unless you're playing against some token deck that has a huge army out, in which case you can just Toxic Deluge for 2 or 3, then drop this, start swinging with it, and just obliterate the rest of their board presence. When it's put into a graveyard from play, all of them shuffle back in. So it has that ability too. It That Betrays, 12 mana, 11/11 with Annihilator 2. Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, put that card onto the battlefield under your control. Now, this does happen immediately when the permanents die. There are some cards where it's end of turn. This one just puts it on afterward. Now, obviously, you cannot swing with any creatures even if they have haste, because you've already declared your attackers, even though this happens like before they block. But you get those permanents, so if they sacrifice lands, well, you get more lands. They sacrifice creatures that are non-token, well, you get those creatures. It's an 11/11, so it's got a nice body. It's a big beater, and it can slowly whittle away their board presence. Even if you're not able to make them sacrifice creatures, because say they have Sigarda out, it's still a big creature, and they're going to lose creatures just to blocking it. And finally, Emrakul. I was actually a bit skeptical about this card when it first came out. So it is a 13 mana, 13/13. It costs 1 less to cast for each card type in your graveyard. So the card types are instant, sorcery, creature, artifact, enchantment, planeswalker, and tribal. So there are up to 7 cards. A lot of the times you can decrease this card by about 4 or 5 pretty easily. We do run rocks. I mean, instant sorceries, those get cast pretty quickly and your creatures die. We have lands. So yeah, usually it's pretty easy to decrease it by about 4 because we run fetch lands. Do keep this card in mind if you, when you're playing Deathrite Shaman, that you don't exile all of your lands if you're planning on playing this, if you're trying to get this out earlier. When you cast it, Gain control of target opponent during his or her next turn. After that turn, that player takes an extra turn. Now, if you want in this deck, you can run Stranglehold, in which case you just take their turn and they get no extra turn. You're usually able to do enough damage to them where that extra turn doesn't do very much. You can make them play a bunch of spells and counter their own spells repeatedly. You can make them strip mine their own lands. You can make them swing their creatures into yours so that they all die. In addition to those effects, Emrakul also has flying, trample, and protection from instants. A lot of the targeted kill spells in Commander are instants, so they can't cast Swords to Plowshare, Path to Exile, Beast Within. They can still Vindicate it because that's sorcery speed removal, but Emrakul is pretty hard to deal with, and your opponents would have to usually deal with it on their own turn, and they're probably not going to Cyclonic Rift it. So you play this, take their next turn. If it dies, well, then you can just get it back to Phyrexian Reclamation. If somehow you're able to cast this 3 times in a turn, because say you have a lot of mana out, then you can take 3 players' turns. That can be a little dangerous because they will then try to work against you on their extra turns, but generally you can probably swap the entire game in your favor at that point if you're able to play it 3 times. I've done that once or twice, generally with the help of something like Oblivion Sower. And we have one last card in here, and that's All Is Dust. This card is necessary if you're playing an Eldrazi deck. No matter what kind of Eldrazi deck you're playing, it's a 7-mana tribal sorcery Eldrazi. Each player sacrifices all colored permanents he or she controls. Now, lands are always colorless. I think Dryad Arbor might be green, I don't know though. But all of your Eldrazi are colorless. Even the ones with colored mana say devoid, so they are all colorless. They will all survive an All Is Dust. I would be careful with playing this card if you're playing the Child of Alara. That's part of why I don't play it quite as much as I used to. Or just in general, I mean, if it dies, you lose a lot of your Eldrazi. The 2 Ulamogs are indestructible. So this is a pretty fun deck. You get to play with really big, beefy creatures, which is something that I always love. That's why I like Xenagos so much. The weakness to it is a bit slow to get started, and usually you're only playing 1 or 2 threats per turn, so they can be pretty vulnerable if your opponents still have things like Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares. If people start killing off some of your lands early, they start ghost quartering certain lands, like your Eye of Ugin, or things like that, that could slow you down a bit. Once your deck gets going, though, it's very hard for people to stop it. Once you start getting 2, 3, 4 of the large Eldrazi Titans out, the Titans are Ulamog, Kozilek, and Emrakul. It's what they're called in the story, but they also have some of the biggest effects of all the Eldrazi. Even if you can get a decent amount of the small ones out and start getting some board presence out there, getting some board control of some of the cast effects. As I said, getting some out as early as turn 7, maybe even turn 6 is fairly common. So you can try to get them out a little bit before your opponents have all their board presence set up, or all of their, or before they're able to stabilize. The cast triggers do get around a lot of counter spells, unless your opponents have things like Void Slime, but there's only, I want to say there's only 4 cards in Magic that counter triggered effects, because their casts are triggered abilities. This is the last out of my personal decks. Next week I'll probably either be uploading or showing off a few of my friends' other decks, or we'll be looking at some homebrews for other formats. We'll definitely continue doing Commander deck techs. It just might be a little different. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.